The night Lena Ashvale walked into Austerly Hall, she was wearing mud on her cheekbone and shame in her spine. Her dress, the only good one left to her name, was torn at the hem where the carriage wheel had caught it as it tipped sideways into a ditch 3 miles outside the village. Her dark hair, carefully pinned that morning, had come loose on one side and now curled in damp strands against her neck. The lantern light from the ballroom poured over her the moment she stepped through the great oak doors, and 200 heads turned, slowly, terribly, like a tide pulling back from the shore before a wave. The music did not stop. It should have. The laughter, low at first and then spreading like fire through dry autumn grass, was worse than silence. A woman near the entrance in silk the color of champagne raised her fan to her neighbor's ear and whispered something that made the neighbor's eyes travel from Lena's muddy boots to her ruined hem and back again with the slow, deliberate cruelty of someone who has never once feared being looked at. Lena stood still in the doorway. She did not step back. She had walked 3 miles on the cold November road to get here. She had walked those miles with her skirts hiked above her knees, her boots soaked through, and her heart tucked somewhere between her ribs where it could not be easily broken. The carriage she had hired, the last of her savings, every coin carefully counted into a driver's palm, had lost its left wheel in the dark and thrown her into the ditch like something disposable. The driver had offered to take her back to the boarding house in town. She had told him no. She had a name on the guest list. She had an invitation, real as silver, pressed and sealed with the crest of Austerly. She had brushed the worst of the mud from her face with the back of her hand, straightened her dress as best she could, and walked. She had not cried. She had learned years ago that tears were a luxury she could not afford. So she had walked. And now she was here, in the light and the laughter, and she refused to disappear. The ballroom of Austerly Hall was a cathedral of light. Its ceiling arched 30 feet above the polished floor, painted in sweeping clouds and gold-edged angels. 3 chandeliers hung in a line down its center, each one blazing with hundreds of candles whose heat breathed down on the assembled heads of half the county. The women wore silk in every shade, midnight blue, sage green, ivory, and rose, and the men stood in dark coats with white cravats that glowed like snow in the candlelight. The orchestra played from the far end, a waltz that moved through the room like water. Everywhere there was perfume and champagne and the sound of polished silver conversation. And there, in the doorway, stood Lena Ashvale, mud on her boots, rain on her collar, a rent in her dress that no amount of holding herself straight could hide, looking at all of it with eyes so still they might have been carved from dark stone. Lady Dorinda Price, standing near the marble column with her circle, pressed her fingers to her lips to hold back what was clearly delight. "Good heavens," she said softly. "Did something crawl in from the road?" Lena heard it. The ballroom was not that large, and Dorinda's voice, though kept sweet, was made to carry. Several heads nearby turned toward Lena again, and this time the assessment was thorough. The muddy hem, the loosened hair, the plain fabric of a dress that had probably been fine enough before the ditch had its say. A footman materialized at Lena's elbow, his face carefully blank in the way of professional men trained to manage embarrassment. "May I help you, miss?" he said, the word "miss" stretched thin as paper. Lena did not look at him. She was scanning the room with a precision that those watching might have mistaken for panic, but which was, in fact, something colder. She was looking for one face. She had come all this way for one face, and she would find it before they had the satisfaction of removing her. Someone near the column laughed openly now, a young man in a mustard waistcoat, his teeth very white, his eyes unkind. "Someone's goose girl has escaped," he said, loud enough to be heard, and the circle around him rippled with obedient amusement. The waltz continued. The candles burned. Lena's jaw tightened so slightly only she knew it. Then the music did something strange. It slowed, not because the musicians meant it to, but in that moment the waltz seemed to drag as though the air itself had thickened. Because across the room, through the columns and the silk and the candle smoke, a man had stopped moving. He was tall, dressed in black with a single silver pin at his lapel, And he stood apart from two other men he had clearly been speaking with, both of whom now looked in the same direction he did. His eyes were on the doorway. His eyes were on her. Duke Adrian Calloway had the kind of face that stopped rooms, and yet he did not move it to cause effect. He simply looked, and the air rearranged itself around him. He had dark eyes and a jaw cut like stone, and his expression, at this particular moment, was one that those who knew him would have recognized as dangerous, not threatening but deliberate. He was not surprised to see her. He was not amused by the laughter echoing around the room. His expression was something else entirely. Something that no one in that room, not even Lena, could yet name. He moved. The crowd parted for him the way water parts for a ship, not because it wanted to, but because the force was too certain to resist. Lady Dorinda, still positioned at the column with her fan half raised, watched his direction and went quite still, her smile faltering at its edges. The young man in the mustard waistcoat stepped sideways as though he needed air. The footman at Lena's elbow looked from her to the approaching Duke with an expression that passed rapidly through confusion, recalculation, and finally a kind of terrified neutrality. The Duke crossed the entire length of the ballroom. He did not rush. He did not look at any of them, not at Dorinda, not at the waistcoat, not at the dozens of faces following him with open curiosity. His gaze was fixed on the woman in the doorway with mud on her boots and her chin at an angle that suggested she would stand there all night if necessary. He stopped 3 feet from her. 200 people held their breath. And then the Duke of Austerly spoke into the silence of the room. "Miss Ashvale." His voice was quiet, measured, and absolutely clear. It crossed the space between them like something with purpose. He did not look at her dress or her boots or her loosened hair. He looked at her face, directly, entirely, without the sideways glance of a man performing courtesy. "I am glad you came." He offered his arm. Just that. An arm extended in the same unhurried manner he might offer it to a duchess in diamonds. Lena's hand was still at her side, trembling with cold she would not let her face admit. She looked at the arm. She looked at his face. Behind him, she could feel the room watching, 200 pairs of eyes burning against the back of his coat and into her ruined dress. She was aware, with a clarity that hurt, that whatever she did in the next 3 seconds would be the thing they remembered. She was also aware, dimly, strangely, that Adrian Calloway had crossed the room for her. Not for anyone else. For her. Her fingers moved. They found his sleeve. And Lena Ashvale, dirty and shaking with cold, walked forward into the light on the arm of the Duke. But why he had called her name, that question would not be answered tonight. Not easily. For years before the night of the ball, Lena Ashvale had been a different kind of girl entirely, or rather, she had been the same girl in a different world. She had grown up in Hartwell Park, a pale stone house set on 60 acres of Dorset meadow, the kind of property that wasn't vast enough to be grand but was too beautiful not to love. Her father, Edmund Ashvale, had been a man of middling fortune and enormous warmth, the sort of father who read aloud at breakfast and remembered the names of every person who worked for him. Her mother, Cecile, had died when Lena was 9, and Edmund had raised his 2 daughters, Lena and younger Nora, with a fierce, quiet tenderness that made the house feel full even when it was very still. Lena had learned to ride before she could dance, had read every book in her father's study before her 14th birthday, and had grown into the kind of young woman who asked questions that made older men uncomfortable and made her father proud. She had been, in those years, secure. Not rich, but secure. Not celebrated, but known. And she had not understood how fragile security truly was until the letter arrived. The letter came in March, when the daffodils were just beginning to open along the lane to Hartwell Park. It was from a solicitor in London whose handwriting was very neat and whose news was very bad. Edmund Ashvale had, over 3 years, entrusted the management of his modest investments to a man named Gideon Price, a respectable name in the county, connected to old money, attended church regularly. Price had taken Edmund's trust and stripped it to the bone, redirecting funds through arrangements so complicated that the solicitor spent 4 pages explaining what boiled down to a simple truth: they were ruined. Not troubled. Not strained. Ruined. Hartwell Park, the horses, the furniture, the remaining investments, all of it liquidated to cover debts that Price had created and Lena's father had unknowingly guaranteed. Edmund Ashvale sat at the breakfast table with the letter in his hand for a very long time. Lena watched his face. She was 20 years old. She watched her father age in the span of a single morning by something that had no number attached to it. And she understood, with a silence that settled over her like cold water, that the world had just changed shape. Her father died 8 months after the letter. The doctor called it a failure of the heart. Lena called it something else, something for which she had no clinical name but which she understood in the center of her chest. He had not died of illness. He had died of shame, the very specific kind that settles into a man who believes he has failed his children. He had apologized to her, near the end, in a voice barely louder than the curtains moving in the autumn air. She had told him there was nothing to apologize for. She had meant it. She did not blame her father. She blamed Gideon Price, who had attended the funeral in a black coat and a look of appropriate sorrow that Lena had watched from across the churchyard with a composure so complete it frightened the few people who noticed it. Price had shaken hands with the minister. He had spoken to Nora, now 16, with the practiced warmth of a man who was very good at warmth. He had not spoken to Lena. Perhaps he had felt her watching. Perhaps he had simply known, in the way predators sometimes do, that this particular prey had teeth. After the funeral, Nora was taken in by their maternal aunt in Bath, a pinched woman named Mrs. Orinda Covell who had money and little generosity, but who was at least stable. Nora was 16 and needed stability more than warmth. Lena was 20 and had no such aunt. She had, instead, herself, a small trunk, and a letter of character from the local vicar. She found work first as a seamstress in Dorchester, sewing by candlelight until her eyes ached. Then as a governess for a merchant family in Exeter, where the children were loud and the mother resentful, and Lena lasted 11 months before the mother invented a reason to dismiss her. Then, for 2 years, she worked as a copy editor at a small printing house in Bristol, the kind of work no one expected from a woman, which was exactly why Lena was good at it. She kept her head down. She kept her savings tight. She wrote to Nora every week and received letters back that were cheerful in a way that suggested Nora had learned to be careful. And through all of it, through every cold boarding house and every evening meal of bread and cheese, Lena Ashvale kept one thing burning: the name. Gideon Price. She had come to know, in those years, that what Price had done to her father was not a singular crime. There were others. She had heard names, other men, other modest fortunes quietly gutted, other families dissolved, and she had begun, in the methodical way that had always been her nature, to collect them. Names, dates, months. Fragments gathered from newspapers and conversations in printing houses and, once, from a very drunk solicitor's clerk at a public house who didn't look twice at the quiet woman nursing her cup of tea in the corner. Price had married well since her father's ruin. He had married Lady Dorinda Whitmore, now Lady Dorinda Price, and through her connections had risen further, faster, into the sort of society that didn't ask questions about the past because the present was so sparkling. They attended the best houses. They danced at the finest balls. And now, this season, they had received an invitation to the Grand Autumn Ball at Austerly Hall, and through an old friend of her father's who had never forgotten Edmund Ashvale's kindness, so had Lena. She had not come for the dancing. She had come for the reckoning. The friend was Lord Corvin Seal, a quiet, thick-set man who had been her father's schoolfellow, who had visited Hartwell Park twice a year throughout Lena's childhood, bringing chocolates from London and arguing happily with Edmund over chess. Corvin had built himself a modest but honest fortune in wool trade, and he was not the kind of man to forget who had treated him well before he had money. When Lena had written to him from Bristol 3 months ago, a careful, specific letter that asked for nothing except the chance to speak to someone she could trust, He had replied within the week. After she had laid out for him what she had gathered over 4 years, he had gone very quiet, and then written, "There is someone you must speak to. Someone who may already know what you know, and who has the power to do what you cannot." He had not named the Duke in that letter. He had named him in the next one. And Lena had spent 3 weeks telling herself it didn't mean anything, that what had existed between her and Adrian Calloway was gone, as unreachable as Hartwell Park itself. She had not quite convinced herself. Because 4 years ago, before the letter, before the ruin, before all of it, there had been one summer evening at the county races in Dorchester where a young woman who rode well had nearly collided her horse with a man on a bay gelding at the bend of the track. Both of them had pulled up, breathless and laughing, and looked at each other for a moment that had, she told herself, meant nothing. She had been 19. He had been 25, not yet titled, his father had still been alive, and he had looked at her with dark eyes and said, with careful delight, "Are you always this reckless, miss?" And she had said, "Ashvale." And only on Tuesdays, which had made him laugh. A real laugh, unexpected and warm. They had ridden back to the rail together and spoken for an hour about horses and books and the particular quality of autumn light in Dorset. She had thought about that afternoon more times than she cared to count. She did not know, until Lord Corvin told her 2 months ago, that Adrian Calloway had thought about it too. She did not know what to do with that knowledge. But somewhere beneath all the careful purpose, all the 4 years of mud and cold rooms and locked emotions, it had never quite gone cold. The night before the ball, Lena sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the boarding-house room she had taken in the village of Austercross, and she looked at her dress. It was green, a pale, tired green, like winter grass trying to remember spring, and it had been the finest thing she owned, which said more about the state of her wardrobe than about the dress itself. She had pressed it twice, borrowed a flat iron from the landlady, and sewn a small tear in the shoulder seam with thread that was not quite the right color but close enough in dim light. It was not a ball gown. It would not be mistaken for one. But it was clean, and it was pressed, and it would have been sufficient if she kept near the walls and avoided the direct light of the chandeliers. She had a plan after all. She had not come to Austerly to be seen. She had come to speak to Lord Corvin, who would introduce her to the Duke, who, if Corvin was right, was already investigating Gideon Price's financial dealings and needed what she had gathered to close the net entirely. Tonight was supposed to be clean, controlled, and quick. She had the documents in a small leather folio tucked inside her trunk. 4 years of careful work, copies of letters, account records she had obtained from the Bristol printing house where Price had once unknowingly employed her under a different surname, ledger comparisons, and signed witness statements from 2 of the other ruined families who had agreed, cautiously, conditionally, to put their names to what she knew. It was not everything a court would need. But it was enough, Corvin had told her, to hand to the right person. And the right person, apparently, was a duke who had his own reasons for wanting Gideon Price brought down, reasons Corvin had not fully explained in his letters, only hinting that the Price matter crossed into territory beyond simple fraud. Lena had not pressed for details. She understood the limits of correspondence. She would press for details in person, in the 15 quiet minutes that Corvin had promised to arrange at the ball, away from the dancing and the champagne and the eyes of Lady Dorinda Price, who would be there and who would, if she recognized Lena, become a serious problem. Dorinda Price knew her by sight. They had met twice, once at a county garden party the summer before the ruin, when Lena had been Edmund's daughter and Dorinda had been an ambitious young woman with expensive taste and a talent for calculating who was worth speaking to, and once, 18 months after the ruin, in the street outside a Dorchester bank, when Lena had been in her seamstress coat and Dorinda had been in carriage silk, and Dorinda had looked at her with an expression that managed to be both triumphant and bored. They had not spoken. But Dorinda had remembered. Lena was certain of it. Dorinda Price was the kind of woman who catalogued the fallen with the same precision she catalogued the risen, because both were useful to know. which meant tonight, at the ball, Lena would need to be quick and careful and gone from Dorinda's sight before recognition could crystallize into action. It was a tight plan. It depended on things going smoothly. It depended on arriving intact, on finding Corvin quickly, on being nothing more than a shadow at the edge of the room. And then the carriage had come off in the dark, 3 miles outside the village, and the plan had shattered along with it. She had sat in the ditch for 30 seconds. Exactly 30, she had counted them, deliberately, like a woman using numbers to hold herself together. The wheel lay 6 feet away in the mud. The driver stood at the horse's head looking at her with the expression of a man calculating how much of this was his fault. The night was cold. Her dress was wet. The folio, blessedly, she had been holding on her lap, and it was only slightly damp at one corner. She looked at the driver. She looked at the dark road ahead. She made a calculation of her own. The people waiting at the end of that road were more important than the mud on her dress or the cold in her boots. And if she turned back now, she would never have another chance at this. Price would not be at Austerly again. Corvin had told her that. The Duke's investigation had reached a point where what she held in that folio could determine everything, or it could quietly disappear if no one delivered it tonight. She had stood up, mud and all, and started walking. Sometimes the most important decisions look like nothing at all from the outside. From the outside, she just looked like a woman walking in the dark. The 3 miles had taken her just over an hour. She had found her rhythm after the first half-mile, the familiar steadying that came when her body understood this was serious work and stopped making complaints. The road was pale gray under the cloud-covered moon, and the countryside around her was the deep, sleeping black of November, hedgerows and fields and the far-off orange glow of a farmhouse window. She passed no one. A fox crossed the road 30 feet ahead of her, paused to look back with flat amber eyes, and vanished into the hedge. She had thought, walking, about her father, about the specific way he had looked sitting at the breakfast table with the solicitor's letter, the way his hands had stayed completely still on the paper. She had thought about Nora in Bath, who was 20 now, who deserved better than a pinched aunt's charity. She had thought about the 2 other families whose names were in the folio, the Whitfields and the Clares, who had told her quietly that they trusted her. She had reached the gates of Austerly with mud to her knees and her jaw set like stone. The lanterns lining the drive blazed ahead of her. She had not hesitated. The footmen at the gate had looked at her with the expression of men professionally trained to show nothing but who were, underneath, deeply troubled by what they were seeing. She had produced her invitation. It was slightly damp at the edges, but the crest was clear and the seal unbroken, and after a consultation between 2 footmen and a long 30 seconds of her standing very still in the cold, they had let her through. The drive up to the house was lined with lanterns, and she had walked it with the mud still wet on her boots and the folio pressed against her side, looking at the great lit windows of Austerly Hall as though looking at something she needed to remember. She had walked up the stone steps. She had stood in the doorway. And then the light had found her, and the room had found her, and the laughter had risen like a tide. She had stood there in all of it, chin up, and thought, I have walked 3 miles in November mud to be here. Laugh if you want. I am not leaving until this is done. She had not expected the Duke to see her. She had certainly not expected him to cross the room. She had thought, in her most honest private moments, that if she ever saw Adrian Calloway again, she would need to be put together. She would need to be clean and composed and in control of every surface. She had believed, with the certainty of a woman who has learned to distrust hope, that a man like the Duke of Austerly could not possibly look at Lena Ashvale as she currently was, ruined dress, muddy boots, loose hair, and offer his arm. She had been wrong. And as she walked into the ballroom on that arm, feeling 200 eyes burning into her back, she had felt something cracking open in the locked room inside her chest. She told herself it was relief at having made it through the door. It wasn't entirely. But she filed that truth away carefully, because the ballroom was not the place to examine it, and she had work to do before any other feeling was permitted space. The folio was still under her free arm, damp at the corner, intact. That was what mattered. That was what she had come for. Everything else, the Duke's hand warm under her fingers, the way he had walked toward her like she was worth walking toward, she would examine later. If later ever came. First, the work. Adrian Calloway had known, for 6 months, about the investigation into Gideon Price. He had not started it. That credit belonged to a Treasury clerk named Aldous Kemp who had noticed a pattern in land deed registrations that shouldn't have existed and had brought it quietly to Lord Corvin's seal, who had brought it to the Duke's attention. What the Duke had done next was what he tended to do with important things. He had looked at the evidence with the same cold precision he brought to everything, and he had decided, without drama, to finish it. Not because Price had wronged him personally, that was not, at the time, the reason, but because the pattern Kemp had identified pointed to something beyond fraud, a deliberate, systemic theft from men who could not afford it. People like Edmund Ashvale. The name had come up in the records early, attached to a modest sum and a date that, when Adrian checked it against other things he remembered, had produced a very specific, unwelcome jolt of recognition. He had set the papers down. He had sat very still for a moment. And then he had picked them back up and kept reading, because there was nothing else to do. He remembered Lena Ashvale. He remembered her clearly and without effort, the way you remember things that have become part of your inner furniture without your permission. The afternoon at the county races, she had pulled up her horse at the bend and looked at him with pure startled amusement that was completely unperformed. She had not known who he was at first. She had simply reacted to a near collision with a kind of laughing, startled relief that was entirely her own. He had thought about that over the years. The way she had argued about something, Tolstoy, some novel he had been dismissive of, and she had taken him to task for it with cheerful, absolute certainty, and he had found himself defending a position he didn't actually hold just to keep her talking. He had asked her name at the end of the afternoon. He had intended to seek out her father. His father's illness had worsened that winter. The world had taken over. He had not called on Edmund Ashvale as he had intended. And then the name Ashvale had appeared in the fraudulent records, and the world had taken on a very particular quality of guilt, not for the fraud, but for the failure to follow through. He had asked Corvin what had become of the family. Corvin had told him. He had listened to all of it, the death of the father, the younger daughter taken by an aunt, Lena somewhere in the west of England working, and he had received the information with the same controlled silence he maintained in bad situations. He had felt, beneath the silence, something considerably less controlled. Not guilt exactly, he had not committed the fraud, but a specific, heavy awareness that he had meant to do something and had not, and that the cost of that omission had been paid by someone else. He had made it his business, subsequently, to know where Lena Ashvale was. Not in an intrusive way, he had simply asked Corvin to let him know if there was ever anything useful to be done. And when Corvin had written 3 months ago to say that Edmund Ashvale's elder daughter had been quietly, methodically gathering evidence against Price for 4 years and had more than either Corvin or Kemp had managed to obtain, the Duke had read that letter twice. Something shifted in him, slowly and without announcement, the way foundations shift when a weight is finally removed. He had told Corvin to invite her to the ball. He had not told Corvin why the invitation mattered beyond the practical. Corvin was perceptive but discreet, and he had simply arranged it and said nothing further. Adrian had spent the subsequent weeks separating the personal from the professional in the way he always managed difficult things, by putting them in different rooms in his mind and working on the professional one first. He reviewed the evidence. He finalized the legal arrangements with the solicitor building the case against Price. He arranged for Magistrate Fielder to be present at the ball, discreetly in civilian clothes, so that if the evening went as planned, Price could be formally confronted on the same night the evidence was delivered, reducing his chances of flight. It was a plan that required precision and a certain amount of luck. It was the kind of plan, he had thought, that Lena Ashvale, from everything Corvin had described, would understand and approve of. He had wondered, with a professionalism he mostly maintained, whether she would be different. Whether 4 years of hardship had taken something from her. Whether the woman in his memory had been softened or broken by the years between. She had walked in through the doors covered in mud, with her chin at an angle that could only be described as defiant, and he had felt, with a clarity that required no analysis, that she was not different in the ways that mattered. The hardship had not taken her spark. It had, if anything, made it more concentrated, distilled into something cleaner and more certain, like metal worked in a forge. He had watched her stand in the doorway while the room laughed, and he had watched her not move, not flinch, not look at the floor, and he had felt something in his chest that he was not going to name yet but which had been building. He understood now, since a Tuesday in Dorchester 4 years ago when a woman had nearly ridden her horse into him and argued about Russian literature without knowing his rank. He had moved toward her before he had consciously decided to. Which was unusual. He was not, generally, a man who moved before deciding. He simply understood, standing there, that to remain on his side of the room while they laughed at her would be a choice he could not live with. So he had crossed the room. He had guided her, quietly, without explanation, to the east side of the ballroom where tall windows looked out over the dark garden, away from the worst of the attention. He had spoken to her in a low voice, watching the room. Lord Corvin is in the blue anteroom. 10 minutes. She had said nothing for a moment, and then, very quietly, "Did you know I would come looking like this?" He had looked at her then. "No," he had said. "I knew you would come." He had watched something move through her expression, some emotion she recovered quickly, pressed back into whatever room she kept such things. "The folio is undamaged," she had said, which was not the same as answering but was, he understood, the most important information she had. "I know," he had said. "Corvin told me what you've been building." She had nodded once, the way a soldier nods when a commander confirms the mission is still on. And they had turned toward the anteroom together. But before they reached it, barely a dozen steps from the east windows, Lady Dorinda Price had materialized from the direction of the column, moving with the swift, graceful intent of a woman who has calculated her trajectory in advance. Dorinda's gown was golden and her smile was the kind that had been practiced to perfection, warm and pointed at the same time, like a candle held too close. "Your Grace," she had said, positioning herself directly in their path with the ease of someone who does this routinely. "What a surprise. I didn't realize you had invited." She had let her eyes move to Lena with a slowness that was pure performance, taking in the muddy dress and the loose hair and arriving at an expression of puzzled distaste that was somehow worse than the earlier laughter. The household staff. Adrian had stopped. He had looked at Dorinda Price with the expression of a man who has made a private decision that tonight, the patience ends. He said, in a tone entirely free of heat, "Lady Dorinda, you'll remember Miss Ashvale, I believe? Lord Corvin has told me you crossed paths in the county some years ago." Dorinda's smile did not falter, but something beneath it did, a fractional shift, the kind only someone watching closely could detect, like ice beginning to move beneath its surface. "Of course," she said smoothly. "I remember." The emphasis on "I" carried everything. And beside him, Adrian felt Lena's arm go absolutely still, not with fear, but with recognition. The evening, he understood, had officially become something more complicated than a plan. The Duke said, "I was just about to show Miss Ashvale to the anteroom. We have some estate business to attend to." The word business was a small, perfect piece of misdirection. It invited no further inquiry, carrying the dry implication of documents and ledgers, nothing Dorinda Price would want to associate herself with. For a moment Lena thought it would work. Dorinda's gaze moved between them once more, calculating, and then she said, very pleasantly, "I was hoping to introduce you both to my husband tonight, Your Grace. He was so hoping to speak with you. Perhaps after the estate business?" She said the last two words with a warmth that almost hid their true purpose. She wanted to know where they were going and for how long. She wanted to manage the evening's information, because information in rooms like this was currency. Lena recognized the move. She had watched it at the printing house, and before that at garden parties, and in her own careful study of how people with power kept it. Perhaps, the Duke said, with a finality that was entirely courteous and entirely closed. He moved forward. Lena moved with him. Behind them, Dorinda Price's golden dress stood very still in the candlelight. Lord Corvin was in the blue anteroom, as promised, and he rose when they entered with the expression of a man who has been worrying for an hour and is trying not to show it. He was shorter than the Duke by half a foot, wider through the shoulders, with the reddened complexion and calloused hands of a man who had made his money working rather than inheriting it. He had known Lena since she was 4 years old, and he looked at her now, at the mud, at the dress, at all of it, with a warmth so immediate and uncomplicated that she felt something in her throat tighten without warning. "You walked," he said. It wasn't a question. 3 miles, she confirmed. He made a sound that was half admiration and half distress. "Your father would have done the same." She looked away for a moment, pressing that comment into the locked room and closing the door firmly. Then she looked back, opened the folio, spread the documents across the small round table in the anteroom and said, "Here is what I have." For the next 15 minutes, she stopped feeling anything that was not necessary. This was the skill 4 years had given her, the ability to seal herself completely when the work required it. She walked them through it methodically. The evidence was organized in the way she had learned at the printing house to organize complex material, clearly sequenced, cross-referenced, annotated in a small, precise hand. She identified each document, explained its origin and significance, and connected it to the documents beside it. She watched the Duke's face while she spoke. He read as she talked, his attention moving between her words and the pages with the focused quality of a man sifting for gaps. He asked 3 questions, each one specific, each aimed at the weakest point in her chain of evidence, the points where a defense lawyer might push. She had answers for 2 of them. For the third she said, honestly, that one would require Aldous Kemp's testimony to close. The Duke nodded. "Kemp is here tonight," he said. Corvin confirmed it. Lena looked at the Duke. "You planned for this," she said, not quite an accusation, not quite a compliment. He did not look away from the documents. "I planned for the best case," he said. "You gave me something better than I planned for. That's not the same as planning." He was right. She allowed that he was right. It was in the middle of the 3rd document review that the anteroom door opened without a knock. Not the Duke's secretary, not Corvin's acquaintance, not anyone with any business entering that room. It was a young man, perhaps 22, with Dorinda's coloring and Price's particular way of standing that suggested money and entitlement had been administered in equal measure since birth. Gideon Price had a son. Lena had not known this. He looked at the 3 of them, at the documents spread on the table, and for a terrible moment his eyes swept the pages with recognition. He was not stupid, this son. He understood, in a single glance, that the papers on the table were not estate business in any neutral sense. His face had the particular stillness of someone performing surprise while actually performing calculation. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace," he said. "I was looking for the card room." The Duke closed the folio. "Down the corridor, 3rd door," he said. The young man nodded, withdrew, closed the door. The 3 of them looked at the closed door for 3 full seconds. "He'll go straight to his father," Corvin said. "Yes," the Duke said. He was already moving. What happened next happened fast. The Duke spoke briefly to Corvin, words Lena caught in pieces. "Magistrate, North Drawing Room, 15 minutes. Corvin left. The Duke looked at Lena. "I need you to stay here until I send Corvin for you," he said. She looked at him. "I've been protecting that folio for 4 years," she said. "I'm not sitting in an anteroom while you use it." Something moved across his face, not frustration, but a kind of recalculation, the look of a man adjusting his plan in real time. "Then stay close," he said, "and say nothing to Price unless I ask you to speak. And if he runs?" "He won't run." He said it with a quietness that was not bravado. It was the quietness of a man who has prepared for every exit. He opened the anteroom door and looked back at her once, that same look from across the ballroom, direct and entirely serious, and she thought, I walked 3 miles in the dark for this. I'm not standing aside now. She moved. She followed him out of the anteroom and back into the light and noise of Austerly Hall, the folio pressed against her side, her heart beating its own slow, determined rhythm beneath the torn green dress. The ballroom had shifted in the 20 minutes they had been in the anteroom. The waltz had given way to a quadrille, and the floor was full of moving couples, which gave the room a different energy, more chaotic, less watchful, the crowd's attention distributed across the patterns of the dance. Lena scanned the room. She found Gideon Price within seconds. She had studied his description enough that his face was mapped in her memory like a road she had walked. He was near the far fireplace, a stocky man in a well-cut coat, silver at his temples, with the particular smoothness of a man who had spent decades deciding nothing he had ever done was worth feeling bad about. He was talking to 2 men, his back half-turned, a glass of something amber in his hand. His son stood 6 feet away, angled toward him. As Lena watched, the son moved closer and said something near his father's ear. She saw Price go still. He did not look up yet, but his hand, she noted, had tightened on his glass. The evening was about to turn, one way or another. There was no road back to the ditch now. There was only forward. The Duke reached Price's position by the fireplace when the quadrille was at its most consuming, 6 couples turning in tight formation at the center of the floor, drawing most eyes. The 2 men Price had been speaking with were absorbed by the dance, and Price stood with his back partly to the room in a comfortable posture that would not last. He did not see them approach until the Duke spoke. Price. It was said with no particular inflection, not accusatory, not warm. Simply the word, placed in the air with precision. Price turned. His eyes moved from the Duke to Lena, and then returned to the Duke, and then, with a compelled slowness, moved back to Lena. She watched the recognition happen. She had wondered over 4 years what it would feel like to be recognized by this man. It felt like standing very still while a storm decided which direction to take. His face went through surprise, then a flicker of anxiety, very quickly managed, covered over with the smoothness of long practice. Your Grace, he said. His voice was warm. It was a remarkable performance. And Miss Ashvale. What a surprise. He did not look surprised. He looked like a man deciding how much she knew. Gideon Price had the face of a careful man, not handsome, but assembled with precision, the kind of face that communicated trustworthiness the way good furniture communicates quality, not through beauty but through dependability. He had heavy brows over pale eyes, and his mouth was set in a permanent expression of mild authority, the look of a man who has been right about most things for most of his life and has stopped expecting to be challenged. When Lena was a girl, she had seen him at her father's table twice. Both times he had spoken warmly, listened attentively, and left her father looking pleased. Edmund Ashvale had described him afterward as a practical man, meaning reliable, competent, trustworthy. And Price had made it easy to trust him, Lena had come to understand, with great deliberateness. His warmth was a tool. His attentiveness was a weapon. He had learned, early in his career, that the most reliable way to take something from someone was to make them feel safe first. He had practiced this skill on her father, and on 8 other men like him, and he had been doing it for 15 years, and no one had ever made him answer for it. Until now. I wondered, Lena said, because the Duke had told her to say nothing unless asked, and had not said she could not speak when the moment called for it, and this moment called for it with a certainty she had felt building for 4 years. If you would remember me. She kept her voice level, its surface smooth as polished stone, and watched his face. Price's expression had settled into something practiced, a kind of mild concern, the look of a man who has been confronted with something unpleasant in a social setting and is managing it with grace. Of course I remember you, he said. Your father was a very good man. I was truly sorry for his losses. The word losses, applied to the ruin his own scheme had created, had the quality of a stone dropped from a height. The impact was not the sound but the reverberating silence after. Lena looked at him. She said nothing. She let the silence do its work. The Duke, beside her, watched Price with an expression like a closed door. And across the room, moving quietly toward the north drawing room, Lord Corvin and a third man in civilian clothes were exchanging a nod that meant, ready. I'd like to show you something, the Duke said to Price. He said it the way someone might say, will you take a turn in the garden, pleasantly, without urgency. He gestured toward the corridor leading to the north drawing room. Price looked at the gesture. He looked at the Duke. He looked at Lena. For a single stretched moment, the ballroom held still around them. The music, the couples, the candles all continuing their indifferent noise, and Lena could see him calculating. He was not a stupid man. He understood that something had gone wrong tonight, that the terrain had shifted in ways he hadn't anticipated. His son hadn't been able to tell him enough. The Duke's face gave nothing away, which was deliberately designed to prevent Price from knowing exactly how much was known. He could say no. He could excuse himself and move toward the east door and discover it was already covered. Or he could say yes, and buy himself time to assess and manage and perform, which was what he was best at. He chose performance. Of course, he said and smiled. The walk to the north drawing room was the longest 30 seconds of the evening. They moved through the corridor behind the ballroom, paneled in dark wood, lit by amber flame sconces, and Lena was aware of everything at once. The folio under her arm, Price's footsteps behind her, the Duke 3 feet ahead, the door to the drawing room visible at the end of the corridor. She could still hear the muffled music through the walls, the quadrille continuing without them. She thought, briefly and without sentimentality, of her father's hands on the letter. She thought of Nora in Bath, of Mrs. Sutton's daughters, of Captain Grenwick, of all the small, careful lives that had been quietly emptied. She thought of herself in the ditch, counting to 30, deciding to walk. The door opened. Corvin was there, and beside him, Magistrate Fielder, a lean man whose expression carried the contained weight of someone who has been waiting for the right moment for a long time. And behind Fielder, at the desk, a spread of documents that Lena recognized as the Duke's own investigation materials, laid out in parallel with hers. Price stepped into the room. The door closed behind him. She laid the documents on the desk and began. She spoke calmly and specifically, presenting the fraudulent instruments first, the documents that showed, in Price's own handwriting from correspondence she had obtained at the Bristol printing house, the deliberate restructuring of investment arrangements to redirect funds. She explained, without rhetoric, exactly how the scheme had worked. The dual ledger system, the created liabilities, the timing of transfers that always fell in periods of low scrutiny. She named each affected party, gave each their dates and losses, and placed the corresponding evidence before Fielder, who recorded each item with the brevity of a man who knows the value of precision over commentary. Price said nothing for the first 5 minutes. He listened with a stillness that was not composure, it was calculation. She watched him doing it. She knew the evidence she had against each possible defense. She had spent 2 winters in a Bristol boarding house working out every angle of this argument, every point of vulnerability, every response to every objection. She had prepared this moment the way a bridge is built, beam by beam, tested under weight, rebuilt when something failed. It was not going to fail tonight. Then Price spoke. He did it carefully, with the deliberate reasonableness of a man who is very good at being believed. These documents are copies. Without the originals are in the hands of the Treasury clerk who first identified the pattern, the Duke said. His voice was quiet. Mr. Kemp has been cooperating with Magistrate Fielder for 6 months. What Miss Ashvale has provided are corroborating materials that close the evidentiary gaps. Price looked at the Duke. Something cracked in his composure, not widely, but a fracture line appeared, very fine, along the surface of his careful performance. "I see," he said. 2 words carrying the entire weight of a man who has just understood the room. Lena looked at him. She felt no triumph. She had thought, over the years, that when this moment came she would feel something fierce and hot, that the vindication would taste like fire. Instead it tasted like rain. Like something cold and clean that had finally done what it came to do. The candles in the drawing room burned steady and clear, and outside the walls the waltz played on, and in this small warm room, 15 years of careful theft finally met the thing it had never expected, a reckoning. Fielder read the formal charge in a voice that was entirely flat and administrative, which was somehow the most appropriate voice for it. Price's expression during the reading was the most honest expression Lena had ever seen from him, because it was, finally, the expression of a man who is not performing anything, who has no audience to manage, who is simply receiving the full weight of a consequence that has been a long time arriving. He looked, in those 30 seconds, like a man of 60 rather than 45, not physically aged, but stripped of the quality that performance gives a person, and what was underneath was smaller and plainer than what had been on the outside. He signed what Fielder placed before him. His hands were steady, which Lena noticed. Even now, the professional, practiced steadiness of a man for whom self-control was the only personal quality he had ever consistently maintained. She thought, my father's hands went still from grief. This man's hands are steady from habit. The difference was the whole story. Lord Corvin by the door said nothing. He was watching Lena with an expression that she did not look at directly, because if she looked at it directly, she would have to feel it. And the work was not quite finished yet. The north drawing room of Austerly Hall was not a large room by the standards of the house. It was a working room, built for the estate's business, lined with bookshelves and a fireplace that gave warmth without fuss. The Duke walked Price from the room with Fielder at his side, and the door closed behind them with a sound so ordinary it seemed almost wrong. The ballroom music drifted through the walls. A country dance now, louder and looser, the sound of people who did not know what had just happened in a small room at the back of the house. Corvin remained. He stood near the fire and looked at Lena and did not speak, which was a particular kind of kindness. She stood at the desk and looked at the documents still spread across it, for years of evenings in cold rooms, of copying by candlelight, of following paper trails through printing house files with a care that no one had known about and no one had asked of her except herself. She was not going to cry. She simply was not, and it was not a discipline, it was just the truth. The tears were not ready yet, and perhaps they never would be in this form. What she felt was larger than tears and quieter. She thought about the 8 families. Each story in the folio had the same architecture. A trusted introduction, a scheme dressed in the language of opportunity, and then the slow, systematic removal of everything that could be removed. Price had been doing this for 15 years. 15 years, 8 families, and a fortune quietly assembled from other people's destruction, which had been used to purchase the kind of social position that made it possible to keep doing it, because men in good standing at good addresses with well-connected wives were not the sort of men one questioned. The evidence had taken 4 years to compile precisely because every thread she pulled led deeper into a structure built deliberately to be invisible. The people who had given her their names, the Whitfields, the Clares, had done so cautiously because they had learned, the way all people who have been robbed by a respectable man learn, that the world was more inclined to question the accuser than the accused. They had trusted her anyway. She had not taken that lightly. Not once. She gathered the documents, page by page, in the order she had organized them, and placed them back in the folio and closed it. She held it against her chest for a long moment. Corvin crossed the room and stood beside her. Edmund would have, he started. Don't, she said. Not unkindly. He stopped. She nodded once, slowly, and he accepted it with the understanding of a man who has known grief long enough to know its limits. She set the folio on the desk. The fire moved in the grate, small and steady, And outside the ballroom walls the November wind was doing something indifferent to the countryside. The room smelled of old wood and candle wax and the faint sweetness of the fire, and it was warm, and she stood in it, and she let herself feel, for a few careful seconds, the particular exhaustion that comes from carrying something a long time and having finally set it down. Not relief, not yet. More like the physical sensation of unclenching a fist that you have not realized has been clenched. She breathed. She had walked 3 miles in the dark to get here. She had walked into a ballroom full of laughter and stood without flinching. She had spoken every fact she had gathered directly to the face of the man who had emptied her family. She had not shaken. And now, in this quiet room with the fire going and Corvin beside her, she allowed herself, for just a moment, to feel the size of what that had cost. The ballroom continued. This was the strange thing about large events, that something enormous could happen in a side room while 200 people waltzed and drank champagne, entirely unaware that the evening had changed shape. Lady Dorinda Price was still near the column, her champagne glass lowered an inch, watching the door to the north corridor with the controlled attention of a woman who is preparing, without knowing for what. When the door opened and she saw Fielder and Price emerge, saw her husband's face, saw the particular quality of his walk, Dorinda's expression did what faces do when the architecture they have been living in is revealed to have been built on compromised ground. It was not a collapse. She was too controlled for a collapse. It was more like watching water freeze, a rapid, progressive stillness, spreading outward from the center. Price said something to her in a low voice as he passed, brief, presumably explanatory, probably not enough. Dorinda received it without expression. She was, in this moment, performing the only piece of theater that mattered. She was performing ignorance. Lena watched her from across the room and felt no particular feeling. Dorinda had not built the scheme. She had benefited from it and asked no questions, which was its own kind of choice. Lord Corvin spoke briefly to a small cluster of guests, the kind of discreet, purposeful speaking that manages crowds, and the energy in the ballroom shifted almost imperceptibly the way a flock of birds shifts direction, not dramatically, but completely. Price was guided, without fuss, toward the estate's private exit. The magistrate went with him. The music played on. Most of the room would learn what had happened over the next several days, through the newspaper and the particular speed of county gossip. But tonight, in the ballroom, the waltz completed its pattern and the candles burned and the supper table was opened and life went on in the way it persistently does, indifferent to the enormity of what has just occurred in rooms it cannot see. Lena stood at the edge of the ballroom and felt the particular exhaustion that comes not from physical effort but from the sustained carrying of something heavy that has been set down. Her feet were wet still inside her boots. The mud on her dress had dried into a pale, powdery crust at the hem. Her hair was still half loose. None of these things had changed. And yet everything else had. The score was settled. The record existed. Her father's name was written, somewhere now, in the column marked, "The Wronged." The Duke returned to her side. He did not say anything about what had just happened in the north drawing room, in the way of someone who understands that certain things do not require commentary because they are complete in themselves. He stood beside her and looked at the ballroom, and for a moment they were both quiet. The silence between them was the silence of two people who have just done something difficult together and are letting the adrenaline settle before they speak. Someone was laughing near the supper table. A real laugh, unguarded, the laugh of a woman who had heard something genuinely funny and was too pleased to manage it. The candles above sent their warmth down over everything, and the room smelled of supper and roses and warm people, and somewhere behind the walls the November wind was doing something cold and irrelevant to the countryside. Lena exhaled slowly. The Duke looked at her. "Are you cold?" he asked. She looked at her boots. "My feet are," she said. He almost smiled. It was the first time she had seen him almost smile, and it was different from what she had expected. It was not polished or controlled. It was genuine in the way of a man who doesn't often allow it. She filed that detail away to, "I owe you an explanation," he said. She looked at him. For the invitation? For being 4 years late. She held the folio tighter. She had prepared over 4 years for many scenarios involving Adrian Calloway, had prepared, in the least controlled part of herself, for the possibility that he might someday say something she would need to know how to receive. She had not prepared well for that last one. You don't owe me an explanation for my father's choices, she said. No, he said. I owe you one for mine. He looked at the ballroom, not at her. I met you once and I intended to call on your father that winter. And then things happened. And I told myself they had happened in time, and that time had taken care of the rest. The pause. They hadn't. And it hadn't. She looked at his profile, the dark eyes on the room, the jaw, the particular quality of a man who is saying something true and not trying to make it sound better than it was. The locked room inside her chest had a crack of light under the door. She was standing close enough to feel its warmth. She did not open the door yet, but she stopped pretending it wasn't there. The morning came gray and cold over the Auster Valley, the kind of morning that smells of frost and damp earth and the particular quietness of a world that has not yet decided to start. Lena had not slept. She had sat in her room at the Ostercross boarding house, in the chair by the window, and watched the dark outside go through its slow transformation, dark to deep gray to pale gray to the thin, tentative light of November dawn, and she sat with all of it, the evening, the room, the documents, the Duke's voice saying 4 years late. The folio lay on the small table beside her, empty now. Fielder had taken the originals as formal evidence. The copies remained, organized in the order she had organized them, but their purpose was complete. She looked at the empty folio and felt the particular strangeness of a container that has given up its contents, like a hand no longer gripping something it has held for a very long time, suddenly light, suddenly unsure of what to do with itself. She was 24 years old. She had spent 4 of those years in service to a single purpose. And now the purpose had been delivered, and the morning was gray, and she was very tired, and she did not quite know who she was without the weight of it. A note had been slipped under her door sometime before dawn, on Austerly paper, in Lord Corvin's handwriting. It said 3 things. First, Price was in custody. The case would proceed to formal hearing within the week, and the evidence was considered sufficient for charges on 7 of the 8 affected parties. The 8th required additional testimony from the Whitfield family, which Corvin was arranging. Second, the 2 families who had trusted Lena with their names had been notified. Mr. Clare had reportedly sat down and wept in a way that his wife would later describe as the first real crying she had seen from him since his father's funeral. Third, there would be a meeting at Austerly Hall that morning at 10 o'clock, if she was available. The third item was in a different handwriting. Not Corvin's. She read it twice. She set the note down. She looked at the window. The pale gray light was becoming white, very slowly, and she could hear birds starting in the trees outside, small, cheerful sounds, indifferent to the enormity of the previous evening, simply doing what birds do when morning arrives. She pressed her hand flat against the cold glass. Her father had loved mornings. He had always been the first one downstairs. She arrived at Austerly Hall at 5 minutes to 10, which she considered a reasonable demonstration that she had not spent the morning checking her watch. She had done what she could with her appearance, the dress pressed as well as it could be without a better iron, the mud brushed clear from the boots, the hair properly pinned, a shawl borrowed from the landlady in a more dignified color than her remaining options. She looked, she thought, like a woman who had slept poorly and dressed carefully, which was an accurate description. A footman received her at the door with an expression entirely different from the one she had received the previous night. Deferential, attentive, the expression of a man who has been given information about a visitor that has reclassified them. She was shown to the library, a warm, book-lined room on the ground floor with a fire already burning and a tray of tea on the side table. Corvin was there, and rose when she entered, and shook her hand with both of his in the way of a man who has too much to say and is keeping it to a handshake for the sake of everyone's composure. Sleep? he said. Some, she said. Enough, he said. Good. She sat down and poured herself tea and felt, in a quiet way, the strange mercy of being known by someone who had known your father. The Duke arrived 2 minutes later. He was in everyday clothes, dark coat, plain cravat, none of the formality of the previous evening, which somehow made him more present, the way a room becomes more real without its formal furniture arranged. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them did anything performative with the looking. He poured himself tea, sat across from her, and said, Corvin tells me you've been living in Bristol for the past 2 years. Working, she said, because she had learned there was a difference and he seemed like someone who would understand it. At the printing house, yes. He nodded. The Clare and Whitfield testimonies are secured. Kemp has prepared his formal statement. Price's solicitor will attempt a defense based on verbal authorization, but Fielder and I both believe the documentary evidence is sufficient to override it. The hearing is Tuesday. She received all of this in the manner of someone who has been working toward a fixed point for a long time and is experiencing the disorientation of arrival. The 2 families who signed, she said, they'll be treated carefully? The process won't. I will make certain of it, he said. Simple. Direct. No performance of reassurance. She believed him. Corvin made an excuse at some point around 20 minutes in a pressing correspondence, a tenant matter, a thing that required his attention elsewhere. He was not a subtle man generally, but he executed this exit with a deftness that suggested he had been planning it. The door closed behind him. Lena looked at the fire. The Duke looked at the fire. Outside, the morning had settled into a proper gray day, not raining yet, but thinking about it, the sky the color of old pewter over the parkland. A log shifted in the grate, sending up a small shower of sparks that died before they reached the screen. She was aware, in the particular way of the morning after something enormous, that the world had narrowed down to the dimensions of this room. The fire, the tea, the 2 chairs, the books on the walls, and a man across from her who had crossed a ballroom for her without hesitation and had since not made a single move that was not exactly what it appeared to be. She had spent 4 years in a world where almost everything concealed something else. The directness of him was, she was discovering, almost disorienting. Like stepping into a room and finding it exactly the size the door suggested. I'd like to ask you something, the Duke said. She did not look away from the fire. All right, she said. The pause, not uncomfortable, more the pause of a man assembling something precisely before presenting it. Would you consider staying in the county? He said. Through the hearing and possibly beyond. She turned from the fire and looked at him. He was looking at her with the directness she was becoming, she realized, accustomed to, that look that did not perform its own emotion, that simply was what it was. Beyond, she said. It was not quite a question. He looked at the fire briefly and then back at her. I would like to know you, he said. In the proper way. Without the urgent business. Something opened in her chest, very quietly, like a window in an old room that has been shut a long time, swinging on its hinge in a sudden draft of air. She felt it open. She did not immediately close it. She sat with the open feeling and the fire and the gray morning outside and the man across from her waiting, not impatiently, not performing patience, just actually waiting, and she thought, so this is what it feels like when something is genuine. She had almost forgotten. She did not say yes immediately. She had not survived 4 years of cold rooms and careful thinking by making quick decisions in warm libraries with handsome dukes on the other side of the fire. She said, I have a sister in Bath who deserves to leave her aunt's house. He said, yes. She said, I have 2 families who trusted me with their names and who will need support through the hearing. He said, I'm aware, and it will be provided. The pause. You've thought about this, she said. I have, he said. For some time. She looked at the fire again. She thought about the ditch and the 30 seconds of counting and the 3 miles of dark road, and how she had walked them not entirely for the reason she had told herself, had walked them towards something that was partly the folio and partly, if she was honest, the name on the invitation and the memory of a man who had laughed with real warmth on a Tuesday afternoon in Dorchester. She had not been entirely honest with herself for 4 years. She decided, in the quiet library with the fire going and the gray morning outside, to try honesty. "Tuesday afternoon in Dorchester," she said. He looked at her. "You said I argued about Russian literature without knowing your rank." "You did," he said, and something in his voice was warm and real and not managed at all, and she looked at it clearly and did not look away. The hearing took place on a Tuesday, in the County Court of Dorchester, and it lasted 2 days. Lena sat in the gallery with Lord Corvin on her left and Mr. Clare, the Somerset farmer whose life had been quietly gutted by Price's arrangements, on her right. Mr. Clare was a compact, sunburned man who had the hands of someone who worked outside and the eyes of someone who had spent years not being believed. He had come to the hearing in his best coat, which was clean and pressed with the specific care of a man dressing for something important. He sat with his hat on his knee and watched the proceedings with the stillness of someone who has a great deal to lose by moving. Beside him, his wife, a small woman with a direct gaze, occasionally pressed his sleeve without looking at him, the way people touch each other when words would be too much. The Whitfields had sent their eldest son, who was 20 and serious and took notes throughout in a small leather book. Captain Grenwick sat near the back, upright in his coat despite the walking cane, his expression throughout the 2 days the expression of a military man who has waited a long time for a command that finally makes tactical sense. Price's defense was what Lena had expected: professional, careful, and ultimately insufficient. His solicitor argued the verbal authorization defense, that the fund transfers had been made at his client's spoken instruction, impossible to disprove and therefore a reasonable doubt. It was competent but thin against the documentary weight of the case. He suggested that Lena's evidence, gathered over years through a printing house connection, had been selectively assembled, which was technically true of all evidentiary collection, and which Fielder dispatched with a precision that was almost beautiful in its completeness. Then Kemp himself gave testimony, thin and composed, holding his papers with the care of a man who knows they are important, dismantling the verbal authorization defense point by point in a voice so quiet and certain that the courtroom went entirely still to hear it. Price gave testimony on the second morning. He was smooth and warm and credible in the way that had served him for 15 years. It was not enough. The verdict came in 47 minutes. Lena sat in the gallery and did not move while the foreman read it. Mr. Clare, beside her, made a sound very low in his throat, not a sob, something between a breath and a word that had no letters. His wife pressed his sleeve. Outside the courthouse, the November air was sharp and clean, and the sun had come out for the first time in several days, lying flat and bright across the Dorchester street. The stone buildings caught it and threw it back in pale gold. Lena stood on the courthouse steps with the empty folio under her arm. She had brought it, could not have explained why, perhaps because it had been part of this for so long that it felt wrong not to have it present at the end, and she breathed the cold air and felt the sun on her face and thought, done. Not triumphant. Not grieving. Simply done, in the way that things which have taken a very long time are done, with a completeness that is also a kind of emptiness, like a room right after you've moved everything out of it. The street below carried on its ordinary business. A cart, 2 women with baskets, a dog moving along the gutter with purposeful dignity. The world had not noticed. The world very rarely did. But she had noticed. The families had noticed. The clerk Aldous Kemp, emerging from the courthouse behind her with his papers tucked under his arm, noticed enough to nod once in her direction. A brief, complete acknowledgement from a man of few words that meant more than a speech. Corvin appeared at her shoulder. He had been crying, which he was not attempting to conceal. It was so characteristic of him. He had always been a man who cried at funerals and did not apologize for it, that Lena felt something in her own throat that she managed, mostly, to hold. "Your father," he started. "I know," she said. "I know." He nodded. He stood beside her on the courthouse steps in the pale November sun and said nothing more, and she was grateful for that, for the particular kindness of a man who does not require a response to a grief he has named. The Duke stood farther back, near the courthouse doors, speaking quietly with Fielder. He was not performing his distance from her. He was not making a show of propriety. He simply understood, as he seemed to understand most things without being told, that this moment on the steps belonged to her, and to the people who had walked through 4 years alongside her, and that he was not one of those people yet. She noticed him noticing this. She noticed him giving her the space to have the moment properly. The careful accuracy of that read something in her that had not been read in a long time. The specific longing to let someone stay. Nora arrived from Bath 2 weeks later. Lena had written to her the morning after the hearing. A full letter, 6 pages, explaining everything. What had happened, what had been proven, what was going to follow. Nora had written back in 3 days in handwriting larger and freer than Lena had seen from her in years, the handwriting of someone releasing pressure. She arrived at Austercross on the coach, smaller than Lena remembered, or perhaps Lena was larger in some way that had nothing to do with height. They stood on the coaching in step and looked at each other, and then Nora said, "You are completely mad, you know," and hugged her fiercely. Nora was 20 and had her father's warmth and their mother's dark eyes and had clearly spent 4 years in a pinched aunt's house finding creative ways to remain herself. Lena held her younger sister for longer than was strictly necessary and did not say anything, because there were no words with the right shape for all of it, for the 4 years and the boarding houses and the letters and the ditch and all the things she had carried that Nora had never fully known about. That was all right. She knew now. They were both free now, in the specific way you are free when the thing that has been holding you down finally lifts. The restitution proceedings took several months. They were complex and not complete victories. No restitution ever is, because money returned is not the same as time returned or dignity returned or the fathers who died holding letters that told them they had failed. But the Whitfields received the majority of what had been taken. The Clares received enough to rebuild the farm to something like stability. Captain Grenwick, whose pension savings had been entirely swallowed, received a settlement his solicitor described as generous. Grenwick himself described it as late, which was accurate and not the same as inadequate. Mrs. Sutton, the Wiltshire widow, received enough that the youngest of her 3 daughters was able to have a proper season the following spring and made, within the year, a perfectly respectable mash. Lena received nothing from the restitution proceedings. She had not been listed among the official claimants. Her father's estate had been liquidated and the debts paid, and technically there was nothing to reclaim. She had known this from the beginning. She had not come to Austerly for the money. She had come so that what had been done to her father would have, in some formal and visible space, a name. It did now. That was enough. Or it was almost enough. The almost was something she would have to decide about separately. Lord Corvin hosted a quiet dinner in December for the families connected to the case. The Clares came. The Whitfield's eldest son came. Captain Grenwick came, ate heartily, and said very little except once, near the end of the evening, when he said to Lena across the table, "You did this." She had started to deflect. It had been a group effort. It had been Kemp and Fielder and Corvin, and Grenwick shook his head. "You did this," he said again. Not a compliment being polished. A fact being stated. She looked at him. He was looking at her with the level eyes of a man who has assessed terrain for 30 years and knows what he sees. "Your father raised someone worth raising," he said, and returned to his plate. Lena looked at the candle for a long moment. She thought, I know. She thought of Nora across the table, laughing at something Corvin had said, entirely herself, entirely free of Bath. She thought of the courtroom, and the empty folio, and the pale November sun on the Dorchester Street. She thought of a man who had crossed a ballroom for her without hesitation, who was sitting at the other end of this same table right now, not performing his attention, just quietly, entirely present. She had walked 3 miles in the dark. And she had arrived, at last, exactly where she needed to be. Winter settled over the Auster Valley with the slow, deliberate authority of a season that knows it has time. The fields went gray-white with frost in the mornings, and the oak trees along the Austerly drive stood bare and clear-limbed against skies the color of pewter. The evenings came early. The fires were lit at 4 o'clock. And in the library of Austerly Hall, on a Tuesday afternoon, Tuesdays, they had both noticed, seemed to carry a particular significance. Lena Ashvale sat across from Adrian Calloway and argued about something with a cheerful, absolute certainty that had not diminished in the slightest since the afternoon at the county races 4 years before. The subject on this particular Tuesday was the proper management of the Austerly tenant farms, about which Lena had read extensively in the weeks since moving into the small cottage on the estate grounds that the Duke had offered, and she had accepted on the condition that it was clearly understood to be a working arrangement. She would advise on estate matters in exchange for accommodation while she established herself in the county, and this was not charity, it was a professional agreement. He had agreed. He had also not argued. She had been mildly suspicious of his not arguing, but she had taken the cottage. The cottage was stone, 2 stories, set at the edge of the East Parkland with a view of the meadow that had made her catch her breath the first time she saw it. Not because it was grand, but because it was gentle, the kind of beauty that doesn't announce itself. It had a fireplace in the front room and a writing desk under the window and a garden that was dormant now under the frost but would, she could see from the structure of it, be something worth looking at in spring. Nora had come to see it and had stood in the doorway with her hands on her hips and said, "This is the first real thing you've had in 4 years, isn't it?" Which was the kind of statement Nora made that was technically a question but was actually an observation that did not require an answer. Lena had said, "Yes," and Nora had nodded as though something had been confirmed to her satisfaction, and they had made tea and sat in front of the cottage fireplace, and it had felt, in a way that Lena had almost forgotten was possible, like being home. Not the old home. Not Hartwell Park, with its 60 acres and its daffodils and its particular smell of wood smoke and her father's books. A new home. One she had built from the only materials she had, herself. She had been in the cottage for 3 weeks when the Duke asked her to walk with him in the parkland on a Saturday morning when the frost had softened to a cold, clear brightness and the light came in low and gold through the bare trees. It was a real walk, not a walk of deliberate occasion or engineered privacy, but a walk because the morning was fine and they had both been working and the morning was fine and neither of them said so directly, which was how things tended to work between them. He walked slightly behind her on the narrow path, and she set the pace, and they talked about the tenant drainage reports she had been reviewing and about a letter she had received from the Whitfield family. The eldest son had begun agricultural school in London, which she had helped arrange, and about a book she had found in the Austerly library that she had not been able to put down, which she had apparently read twice. They had disagreed about the ending. This had been, she noted, the 5th thing they had disagreed about productively, which was a specific kind of satisfaction, the satisfaction of being argued with by someone who means it, who does not soften their position out of courtesy or harden it out of ego but simply holds it honestly and listens to the counter with genuine attention. They stopped at the edge of the meadow where the park met the open ground, and stood for a moment in the cold air looking at the frost on the grass and the pale sky above it. A crow crossed overhead, unhurried, its wings very black against the white. "I want to ask you something," the Duke said. She had heard this phrasing before, in the library, the morning after the ball. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the meadow, not at her, in the way he sometimes looked away when he was about to say something real. "You have been here 3 weeks," he said. "And in those 3 weeks I have found, consistently, that the rooms you are not in are less interesting than the rooms you are in." He paused. "That's an inefficient way to live." She looked at him. He looked at her. Something in his expression was uncertain in a way she had not seen before, not the calculated caution of a man managing a situation, but the genuine uncertainty of a man who does not know the answer and cannot manufacture it. It was the most honest thing she had seen from him yet, which was saying something, because he had been honest with her since the night of the ball. She felt, in her chest, the locked room swing fully open. The light from it was very warm. She thought about what to say for a long moment. Not from hesitation. She was not, by nature, a hesitant person, but from the desire to say it correctly. She had a habit, built over 4 years of precise, purposeful work, of choosing words that meant exactly what they were intended to mean and nothing more. She wanted to extend that habit to this. "I have been," she said carefully, "more myself in the last 3 weeks than I have been in 4 years." She looked at the frost on the grass. "I did not expect that. I expected the county and the work and the hearing and the families. I did not expect to find that someone had remembered me well enough, from one afternoon at the races, to cross a ballroom full of people laughing. I did not expect—" She stopped. She looked at him. "I did not expect to want to stay." He was looking at her now with that direct, entirely present look, and in it she could see the thing that had been building since the first morning in the library, the careful, unhurried certainty of a man who has wanted something for a long time and is only now allowing himself to admit that he still wants it. "I want to stay," she said. And then, because she had decided on honesty, "with you." He did not say anything immediately. He was not a man who filled silences that did not need filling. He looked at her in the cold morning air, with the frost on the grass and the bare trees behind her and the pale sky above, and then he said, quietly, without architecture, "Yes." Just that. And it was the same word he had said when she asked if he had planned for her, and the same word he had said when she told him about Nora in Bath, and in every instance it was the same, not a performance of certainty but the real thing, clean of decoration, offered directly. She looked at him. He looked at her. The crow had long since crossed the meadow and disappeared into the trees, and the morning was very still and very clear, and the frost on the grass caught the low winter light and turned it into something that looked, at the right angle, almost like warmth. She reached out and took his hand. He closed his fingers around hers and did not move, simply stood there in the cold morning holding on, in the steadiest way she had ever experienced being held. They stood like that for a long time. Neither of them was in any hurry. Neither of them had reason to be. Later, months later, when the spring had come back to the Auster Valley and the meadow was green again and Nora had found a position teaching at a small school in the nearby village and had taken a room of her own with characteristic decisiveness, Lena would think about the night she had walked 3 miles in November mud to Austerly Hall. She would think about the ditch and the 30 seconds of counting and the driver's face and the long pale road ahead of her. She would think about the doorway of the ballroom and the light falling over her and the laughter, and standing still in all of it with her chin up and the folio under her arm and her heart in the place it needed to be. She would think about a man crossing a room, unhurried, through 200 people, to offer his arm to a woman in a ruined dress. And she would understand, with the clear, unhurried understanding of someone who has had time to see things properly, that the night of the ball had been the beginning of everything, not because the ball was romantic and not because a duke had been kind, but because she had walked into a room full of people who expected her to disappear, and she had refused. She had refused, and the rest had followed. Some doors, you have to walk through before you can see what they were leading to. She had walked. And it had been, in every sense that mattered, worth the mud on her boots.